Jim. All right, so this is, let me set some context. This is a 20-minute session, and we're going to talk about Gitcoin 3.0. Okay, cool. So, hey everyone, I'm Kevin Owocki. I'm the founder of Gitcoin. See some of you in the audience that actually worked with Gitcoin in the past, so thank you for your past contributions. I'm excited to talk about Gitcoin's future today, and the first thing I want to say is that I screwed up the AV. The first thing I want to say is that, to me, Gitcoin's mission has always been what it's all about. We have funded $70 million worth of Ethereum open source software and public goods for the world, and we've landed on this saying, fund what matters. We want to fund what matters in the 21st century, and we think that crypto as a funding substrate is a way that we can do better collective action, and we can fund things that matter to the communities that they serve in a way that doesn't have as much administrative overhead as traditional bureaucracies or institutions do, and leverage the power of networks in order to make sure that the funding makes it to the places where it needs to go. And so, Fund What Matters has been our mission over the last several years, and we've been dogmatically pursuing this mission of building better crowdfunding technology and using it to support the causes that matter in the world. And it's been a winding road. I started Gitcoin in 2017. We called that, in retrospect, we call that Gitcoin 1.0. Having a little bit of AV issues here. That might be me, I'm not sure. Gitcoin 1.0 is basically our centralized grants era. So we basically ran a grants platform, and it was a way of funding what matters to the Ethereum ecosystem. I think, Matilda, if you want to try to make sure the AV is okay. I also just stepped on this cord, so this might be me. Cool. Gitcoin 1.0 was centralized grants, and we eventually stumbled on this mechanism called quadratic funding, which is an extremely democratic way of funding what matters to the Ethereum community. As Gitcoin blew up and it became a super popular project in the 2019-2020 era, Vitalik, I'm proud to say, called us a significant pillar of the Ethereum ecosystem. And for me, this caused a sort of existential crisis because I believe in decentralization, I believe in democratization, but the way I built Gitcoin in the beginning was just wrong. It was just centralized. And so we went on this odyssey of launching Gitcoin 2.0, what was called Gitcoin DAO in the day. And back in the day, and in 2021, we launched the GTC token and decentralized Gitcoin into a community-governed project. Turns out that we were extremely naively optimistic about how DAOs could run, and it was extremely hard to find product market fit in the ecosystem as a grants provider. And I think doing it as a DAO was like 10 times more in hard mode. And so at the time, I exited the project and went off and did my own thing for about 2 years, and decided to come back in 2023 and 2024. And we're calling this new era Gitcoin 3.0. So we basically tore Gitcoin down to its studs, and we're trying to figure out how do we work in the 2026 cycle, in the 2026 environment? How do we work in a world where stablecoins are going mainstream, where the geopolitical environment is changing a lot, and AI is everywhere? It's the hot new thing. And I think that, another thing that I'm seeing that's happening in the Ethereum ecosystem is the increasing amount of plurality that's happening in the Ethereum ecosystem in terms of how it funds what matters. This is a graph that I'm really proud of, this research project that I worked on with John Bowe and Neil, if you're in the audience, to a really talented designer and a really talented engineer that I work with. And basically the way to read this graph is that the x-axis is 2019 to today, and then this is a percentage-based graph showing you where Ethereum public goods funding, things like open source funding, were coming from. And back in the day, it was basically the Ethereum Foundation and Moloch DAO and Gitcoin grants. And I'm really proud that Moloch DAO and Gitcoin grants were pioneers in an on-chain exstitutional way to fund what matters. I see some of my exstitutional friends in the audience. That's just the opposite of an institution. Think like, how would a network fund what matters as opposed to an institution which does it through hierarchy and bureaucracy? Not calling out any specific hierarchies or bureaucracies in this, but I think networks are super cool. And we've always been about pushing the frontier of what's possible. And then in 2021, when Gitcoin, I think, was a name brand in the space, we sort of proved that this is possible. We saw a plurality of different projects that launched in the Ethereum ecosystem that were funding what matters. And some of these were like direct Gitcoin clones. Some of these were just innovative things in a new way. But I'm really proud of what happened with Optimism, retro funding, and Protocol Guild. I think is so cool. And Octant, and Artisan, and CultDAO, and Radical Drips, and QAC, and Giveth, and Cello Public Goods, and DAO Drops. And I could just keep name dropping all these projects, because now we're not just innovating on networks of funding. We're building networks that are building networks of funding. Okay, so it's Fractal. The innovation is just spiraling in all directions. And now we have programmable money. And so the way that we could build democratized institutions that fund what matters is this design space is being explored by the network. And so I'm just really proud that we were early to that and sort of like in a lot of ways proved that it was possible. But I also think that now that I'm returning to Gitcoin and we're trying to reinvent it, the world has just changed so much. And it's the obvious things like AI and stablecoins, yes, but it's also the plurality of the Ethereum ecosystem and how it funds what matters that I think we have to adapt to. We're not the only game in town when it comes to on-chain crowdfunding. And so this new direction that we're moving in is going to stay true to the mission, but is going to really embrace the plurality of providers in the space. And I think with that teed off, I will hand it to Mathilda, who's going to tell us about the future of Gitcoin grants. Please join me in welcoming Mathilda.
Thanks, Owocki. So my name is Mathilda. I'm Chief of Staff at Gitcoin. I've been around Gitcoin for like almost 4 years now. Back in the day, we used to call the Gitcoin grants rounds GR. I've been around since GR 15, and we've just concluded, end of last year, we concluded GG 24. So I've been through quite a few evolutions and iterations of the program, and kind of taking a step back, following on what Owocki was saying earlier, the Gitcoin grants program, as I'm sure most of you in this room are familiar with, kicked off in 2019, and we used to run 4 rounds a year, so around a quarter, was really predominantly focused on QF. And that, from 2019 to 2024, that's what we were focusing on. But then in GG23, which was beginning of last year, that was our first multi-mechanism round, we started realizing that, yes, quadratic funding is a really powerful mechanism, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. So we ran our first multi-mechanism round where we experimented with running our own legacy OSS program within 2 buckets. So we bucketed the early stage projects through quadratic funding, which is a really good crowdfunding signaling tool to highlight those early stage projects. But the more mature builders in our ecosystem, we ran them through a retro funding round. And just separating early stage and mature builders was a really successful way of, I don't want to say comparing them to each other, but just putting them in 2 separate pools allowed us to evaluate them in a much more fair and valuable way. And also just going multi-mechanism with our community rounds, we encouraged everyone that came in and applied to run a community round alongside us to become more plural with the mechanisms that they were using. And we saw a lot of really, really great innovation and a lot of great mechanisms coming to the table. What we did in GG24 was we started we went a step beyond that. So kind of like Owocki was mentioning, up until then, it was a very centralized kind of decision-making process with the Gitcoin grants program. We, as Gitcoin, used to decide what to fund in each round. And with GG24, we said, well, actually, we should go to the community. We should go to the ecosystem to figure out what's the most important thing to fund at any given time. So we did a rigorous sense-making process, which I'll get into on the next slide, but that really established kind of the foundation of what we're moving into next. And as you can see through the Gitcoin grants program alone, it's been over $60 million in distributed funding towards builders. We've had also some of the really biggest in the ecosystem get early seed funding through Gitcoin. It's been, for me personally, it's been an amazing journey being part of this program and seeing the evolutions and so many other programs in the space popping up. So something that we saw with the problem first public goods funding that we did in GG24 was the sense-making process. You can't really see the chart on the right too well, but I encourage you to scan that QR code, because hats off to Open Source Observer, specifically Rohit Malakar. He created a GG24 interactive data analysis dashboard, and you can go in and look at the data from each QF round. This one specifically that I'm linking is all about Ethereum problem space mapping, which was that's what we focused on for GG24. We wanted to figure out and fund Ethereum's biggest problems at that time. So what this chart shows is it shows the category, so it's the high-level problem in the Ethereum ecosystem, and then the specific challenges within each category, and then how each round within GG24 addressed those problems. And yeah, so you can go have a look at that detail on that dashboard as well. And what that showed us is it wasn't a perfect round, but it did show us that the outside-in network-first approach is really valuable. So that's what we're doing at Gitcoin now, as we're reinventing ourselves, and also our program is really focusing on that. And like I mentioned, it's really kind of established the foundation for what we're moving into next. And kind of just an interesting thing that we also saw with quadratic funding is that it really worked well. This is also on that data analysis dashboard that I shared earlier. It worked well with the visible tooling, so dashboards, developer frameworks, etc., but it actually underfunded long horizon infrastructure. So I think it is a really important thing that we have been doing in the space for the last year or so, is looking at different mechanisms, because I do think that within the public goods funding ecosystem, we do have to sometimes, maybe quite often these days, just take a breath and take a step back and figure out how are we funding things and how can we change what we're doing. So for GG25, before I hand it back over to Owocki, what we're going to be doing next year, and you guys are getting some alpha here because we have not announced this yet, but as I mentioned earlier, we used to do quarterly rounds, and then we used to do 2 big rounds a year. But what we want to move into next is going smaller but more often. So perhaps going around a month. So what we want to do is kind of take what we learned from GG24 and that domain-first approach, but have a category span, for example, from GG25 to GG29. We want to focus the next iteration on DAC, which is quite a broad category. But then every round can be focused on a specific category within that. I would love to then see within those smaller rounds, maybe builder demos come back and, yeah, just bring in like more value and impact in that way. But I also want to give a huge shout out to Carl Savone from Open Source Observer, Benjamin Life, and Owocki and the team for working on the DAC market map. Owocki, do you want to give a preamble on?
Thanks, Matilda. Forgot that I was speaking again when I walked all the way across the stage. Basically, does anyone in the audience know what DAC is? Raise a hand. Can you just shout it out?
Decentralized accelerationism.
All right. There's 4 of them. Anyone else know the other 2? So the ones that I'm aware of are differential accelerationism, decentralized accelerationism, democratized accelerationism. Excellent. Do you know the 4th one is? There's a 4th one. It's purposely a little bit ambiguous. So basically the idea, DAC is this really interesting set of ideas where basically high level, the idea is that There's the accelerationists, people who think that we should just move faster and move through any contemporary issues we have in society by moving faster with technology. And then there's like the decels, the people who think that, no, we should go back to sort of like farming and move technology out of our lives, like the sort of like Luddite take. And DEAC I interpret as sort of a compromise between accelerationism of everything and the decel position, which is that we're moving too fast, we need to like slow things down. And basically with DEAC, the idea is, what if we accelerated our defensive technologies, our democratized technologies, the things that limit the blast radius when something goes wrong with technology? And over time, if technology is growing exponentially, then the difference between the defensive tech and the offensive tech is going to just mean that we have more stability and we have better things that are better technology that are working for everyday people. So basically, DEAC is this sort of like broad idea set that has been put forth by Ethereum founder Vitalik Buterin of a bunch of things that are good because they follow this sort of like DEAC view of the world. And there's, believe it or not a market map out there for DEAC. So if you want to fund DEAC, if you want to fund things that are contemporarily good, then we want to start having a map of the topology, the cartography of that design space. And so that's what we've put about 3 months of research into producing. You can see basically the left-right axis is atoms versus bits. So basically, are we accelerating defensive things in the physical world or in the digital world? And then the up-down axis is thrive or survive. So basically, are we helping people accelerate human thriving, or are we helping just things that prevent us from having from a lack of survival? And so basically there's a bunch of different subcategories of things, and what I love about this is that it bridges privacy, zero knowledge proofs, as a defensive technology to things like decentralized social or resilient crowdfunding. These are all defensive technologies in a lot of different ways. And so as Gitcoin's moving into funding what matters in a contemporary view, we're turning our aperture of attention from just Ethereum's infrastructure and open source to things that are DEAC for the world, things that are projecting the good things about crypto out into the world, and we're doing that by mapping and sense-making the things that actually exist out there. So we've got an actual physical copy of these infographics that we'll be putting around ETHBoulder. This is the first time we've dropped anything like this. I'd be curious to get your feedback about it, and especially if there's something that we missed. There's a QR code up in the top, and you can tell us about it. I'm a big fan of Cunningham's Law. I don't know if anyone knows what that is in the audience, but it's basically, if you want to know the answer to something, you don't ask the question, you post the wrong answer to it. And then people get so triggered that they have to tell you how wrong you are, but then you get the answers. And so I think we'll publish probably a V2 of this when we release this out on the socials and people are so mad at us for not including their project, which is like the way Twitter works. Then we'll update the map to include everything. And then when GG25 rolls around, I think in a couple months, we're thinking about doing the first GG25 round. We're going to start hopscotching across these domains and funding things that are actually good for the world, exporting the public good funding of Ethereum to the world. So I'm excited about Gitcoin moving forward in this direction, and I think DEAC is a great place for us to wedge ourselves into the next generation of the Ethereum ecosystem. And I think with that, I'll hand it back to Matilda, who's going to close us out. Is that right? Or am I closing us out?
Yeah, I can close this out.
Okay. All right. Matilda, welcome back.
Thanks. Yeah, and just to go back, so how we're going to be operationalizing GG25 is, I think, Owocki, you said hopscotching from one to the next throughout the next few rounds. And I'm actually going to be co-hosting a workshop on this at 2 p.m. at Terrible Turtle with Benjamin Life, who was one of the big brains behind this. So if I would love, this is part of what we're doing now with Gitcoin grants. It's not just us making the decisions. So I would love to work with anyone in this room who is interested in coming on and jamming with us to figure out, like, what should we fund in GG25? You know, how should we be structuring this, and how can we serve the community in a more valuable way every single time we run these rounds? So I'm really excited to be rolling out a more regular cadence of the rounds again, and I'm very excited to see how all of that plays out. So I think it's a very important time in our ecosystem right now to be taking stock, to be figuring out how can we do this better. And as Gitcoin, that's something I'm really proud of with the work that I've been doing with Owocki and the team for quite a few years now, is that that's something that we've always done. We've taken stock, we've figured out where we went wrong, what we did right, and how we can change moving forward. So I'm really excited about this next endeavor. So yeah, join us at 2 p.m. if you are free. Thank you.